Hi, my name is Jennifer Tsuruda, and I'm an assistant professor and apiculture specialist in the Department of Entomology and Plant Pathology at the University of Tennessee. Today, I'll be talking about supporting pollinators in the landscape. The impact of pollinators on humans can be visualized through these pictures of what a breakfast looks like with and without pollinators. On the left, you can see what a breakfast looks like with pollinator impacts. And so you can see there's lots of beautiful fruits, colorful fruits, as well as tree nuts like almonds. And then the coffee actually has creamer versus the picture on the right-hand side that depicts what a breakfast looks like without pollinators. And so some people may be thrown off by the creamer being missing because it's not that bees are pollinating cows, but they're actually having an indirect effect on livestock through the pollination of the food that the livestock eats, so plants such as clover and alfalfa. It's been estimated that about one out of every 3 bites of food we eat has somehow benefited through animal pollination. In the United States, the crops that benefit through insect pollination has been estimated to be worth about $29 billion. And of that, honeybees are contributing about two-thirds of that pollination. We do have many types of pollinators across the globe. One thing that is not depicted, though, in this beautiful poster is the impact of wind. So we have many wind pollinated crops, such as our grains like corn and wheat, but we do have a lot of other types of plants and non food crops that are also pollinated through different types of animals. So when we talk about animals, you can see the variety here in this poster, and some that are commonly known are bats and birds, but also insects. And so when we look at insects, we can also see that there's a diversity of pollinators as well. We do have a lot of bees that do pollination, but we can also see in this collage that there are beetles and flies. But again, of the bees, we use a managed honeybee for many of our crop pollination systems because it has features that we can utilize to be really efficient in terms of getting our crops pollinated. Part of that is that we can move them. So we can move their hives around to crops that need pollination services. And so many of you may not realize that we actually have migratory beekeepers, commercial beekeepers that keep bees just for this purpose. And so here's a map that shows some of these common migratory routes that the beekeepers take to pollinate many of the crops that are grown in specific regions in the United States. We do have a variety, though, of bees that contribute to pollination services that are not mobile, but just as important. And so we have an estimated 4,000 species of bees in North America that help contribute to our pollination services in agricultural areas as well as in natural landscapes. So, what we want to think about is how we can help support pollinators so they can help feed us and help feed others as well. So this creates a situation where we may need to shift our thinking about what our landscape looks like and having it be a functional landscape. And a functional landscape for pollinators may look different than the types of landscapes that we're used to looking at. And so here, this field of dandelions is something that's awesome for pollinators because it's providing nectar and pollen, but it's oftentimes something that homeowners and gardeners may not desire because they think of these as weeds, but these are actually functional and helpful for pollinators. And another thing I'll point out is that these floral resources can also provide phytochemicals that have been shown to help bees, specifically honeybees, in dealing with fighting off viruses as well as pathogens, as well as reducing the effects of exposure to pesticides. So, really having these diverse floral landscapes can help the bees in many ways, and also other pollinators. So when we talk about habitat use, I've already talked about pollen and nectar. And so pollen provides amino acids and protein, as well as minerals and vitamins and fats to the bees, whereas nectar provides carbohydrates. So the sugars in the nectar provides carbohydrates for bees and other pollinators. But there are also plants that get used for nesting materials for some bees. So here you can see these nice circular holes taken out of this leaf made by a leaf cutter bee. And she uses that as she's building her nest and sectioning off different cells of eggs that she's laying. And then there are other types of insects that are actually using the plant tissue itself as a larval food source. So here we can see a monarch caterpillar here feeding on a milkweed plant And so this is one thing to think about too. If you do want to have a more pristine looking pollinator garden, you may not want to plant some of these pollinator plants in your front yard because when they are successfully being used, they will look terrible to your neighbors who may not understand that your goal is for promoting pollinators and not to look like you just have a really poorly managed yard. The other alternative is to put up some pollinator signage so that people understand that you are purposely planting this pollinator habitat, wildlife habitat, and it also serves as a way to educate the public as well. So just thinking about that and how your landscape can actually be used by pollinators can change your mindset in terms of what you're planting. And so oftentimes the questions that we get are about, well, what should I plant for these pollinators? And that depends on a lot of factors. And so some of it has to do with what your landscape looks like, but also what your individual goals look like. And so some that I'll point out too is the site selection. So many of the plants that we use to support pollinators are actually plants that thrive and do well with a lot of sunlight. But there are recommendations we can make for plants or landscapes that have different conditions, if they are more wet or if they have um, maybe a little bit less light in the shady sites, or if you are looking at putting in trees versus um, different types of wildflowers. There is a recommendation, there is a pollinator plant for just about every type of landscape out there, but we do need to know a little bit more about your site selection before making recommendations. So again, paying attention to your region. As many of you know, there are different micro environments within a region as well. Paying attention to your moisture levels. Do you have additional irrigation or are you just relying on rainfall? That can impact what you plant as well as when you plant. Again, that sunlight is really important, thinking about how many hours of sunlight that location gets. And then also, do you have pests? And that means insect pests as well as larger pests, such as possibly some deer coming into your area. There are some plants that we can recommend that are more deer resistant than others. And then permanence. Is this maybe a site that you're thinking of leaving as pollinator habitat for the long term, or is it something that'll just be short term for part of a season or just 1 year? That can affect what we actually recommend in terms of planting as well. Other big factors are how much are you willing to spend? There are opportunities to spend as much money as you would like to spend, but if you are on a more limited budget, there are also some other types of recommendations we can make too. So starting with seed mixes can be a lot cheaper than starting with, or more economical than starting with full plants that you then transplant, depending on numbers and the size of your landscape as well. But also paying attention to your individual goals as well as preferences. What do you want to see happen in your landscape? What do you want it to look like? Do you want it to look like an open prairie? Do you want it to look like a manicured, more like a botanical garden? There are many different options. And then also thinking about the types of pollinators that are in your local environment that you want to support. If you are a beekeeper or if you do have crops around that you need pollination services for, that may influence what you consider planting. But overall, when we're thinking about what to plant, it's really important to think about having forage across all of the seasons or as many of the seasons as we can to try to support these pollinators during the times of the year where they don't have as much exposure to nectar and pollen providing plants during, say, crop bloom time. And so one way we can do this is by making sure that we're planting successive batches of wildflowers so that they don't just all bloom in the spring or early summer, but that we have some resources that bloom in the late summer and fall as well. One thing I like to do is planting a lot of herbs, not only for myself, but also for the bees. So I let some of them go to flower for the bees, but then for the ones I use for culinary purposes, I usually try to keep a little more compact and so I can have the tender leaves there. But I do let some of them go to flower for the bees. And then planting a mix of annuals and perennials has the benefit in terms of having flowers the first year as well as having flowers in consecutive years after that. Some of those perennials may not bloom the first year. And so we always want to see some type of reward for our plantings. And so that's a nice thing about annuals. And they can reseed as well. So you can have them come back year after year as well. And then forage all day. So some of these flowers can run out of nectar or pollen by midday. And so planting some diverse opportunities there, some different types of flowers can help ensure that they have more resources available throughout the day. And also there's variation in terms of the nutrients in the pollen and nectar from the different species of plants. So it helps to have some diversity there. If you want to have diversity in bees for better pollination services, whether it's for an agricultural crop or even your home garden or just the natural landscape, you want to have this diverse set of plants that you're also providing for them in the environment. And if you do want to provide, if you're focusing in on native bees, then planting native plants is a really great way to do that because they are co-evolved together. So that's a great way to attract native bees. We do recommend staying away from some showy ornamentals that have been bred for characteristics that humans like, things like double petals and the appearances that humans like aren't necessarily beneficial to the bees at all. So we try to stay with more of the natural cultivars for the pollinators. And again, thinking about what to plant, there was a really nice study that came out about 10 years ago showing that regardless of the type of bee, whether or not you were trying to support managed bees or wild native bees, there are some plants that have been studied that are really great resources for them in terms of pollen and nectar. And so we have different types of asters. So we have cut flowers as well as goldenrod, and then daisies that are really important too. And because they also are blooming later on in the season, both of these will bloom more towards the late summer, early fall, which is a time where we don't have a lot of other things blooming in the environment. And then also having things like agastache and bee balm. And then one of my favorites is actually mountain mint because it does attract so many different types of native bees and it smells so wonderful and it blooms for a really long period. So I think those are fantastic as well. They make a nice landscape plant, but they can be a little shrubbier and they are perennial, so they come back. And then native legumes have been shown to be beneficial for both types of pollinator or both types of bees as well, wild or managed. One thing I do want to point out though is oftentimes the list that we see provided for plant recommendations for pollinators is due mostly, if not all, just due to attraction and not nutritional value. So there is ongoing research looking at the nutritional value of different plants, but it is a long process to go through the many different types of plants out there to figure out their nutritional value and then to cross-reference that against attraction. So if you think about human diets, nutrition and attraction don't always go hand in hand. And so we'll probably face some similar issues with bees, but there is some really important research going on in that area. One opportunity, if you do have a lot of land, or even if it's not a lot of land, but a large area, is thinking about using cover crops. So if you're doing farming or not doing farming, these are some affordable options in terms of covering a lot of land with plants that not only benefit the pollinators, but also benefit the soil and the landscape. So these are really great plants that you can put out on a large scale. So here I'm showing some buckwheat as well as crimson clover. And so also I'm showing that there's a diversity of pollinators that they also attract. And so it's not just for honeybees, but also for things like different types of bees, native bees, as well as some flies and even butterflies like monarchs have been shown to come out and visit these cover crops. You can also do a little bit of a more manicured setting too. And so here's one of my plots where I'm testing out some different types of sunflowers, as well as zinnias and some other herbs. And so you can have it more in a landscape fashion rather than just as a single type of cover crop. And just showing over time, if this allows me to look at different species of flowering plants and see who's visiting what and for how long these bloom. And it's a really nice opportunity to see different types of interactions of pollinators across this field itself. And I think these are plants that are very visually appealing and would go really well in a home garden setting as well as in a field setting. It does change over time, which is something that we want to see. We do like to see transitions over time so that we do have some plants available throughout the entire season. And one thing that I wanted to point out was here on this sacred basil, I didn't see honeybees visiting it early in the season because they were actually out visiting some of the other plots that we had blooming. But later on in the season, when those other plots dried up, that's when I would start seeing honeybees this was in October, visiting that sacred basil. And so sometimes you may not see pollinators on your pollinator plants if there are other things blooming in the environment, but just keep checking because there may be different times when they will start visiting. Here you can see these zinnias attract some larger pollinators. So here you can see this lovely hummingbird sucking up the nectar from just about every little flower from each of these zinnia flower heads. So it does support many different types of pollinators, which is great. And I do see a lot of butterflies on the zinnias as well, including this clear wing moth here, which mimics and looks a lot like a hummingbird, but is actually a moth. So really cool to see lots of different types of pollinators visiting a plant that's really easy to grow like zinnias. And then I also want to just touch on the importance of thinking about your landscape and then different types of bees too. So we have ground nesting bees, as you caught in that short clip there, that have these inconspicuous little holes and nests that are underground. And so just thinking about that in terms of how you're managing your landscape, not only above the soil, but also below the soil too, and thinking about providing natural landscape, not over mulching so that these ground nesting bees have opportunities in landscapes to then nest and reproduce. And then even with things like stem nesting bees, how we manage our land is really important too. So not just providing food resources, but then how we manage those flowering plants, cutting them down so that the bees can use those stems for nesting is really important. And so these pictures just basically depict how you would manage a lot of these plants over time to allow for the bees to come in and take care and use basically these empty stems. A lot of these plants have soft, pithy interiors to the stems, and so the bees will dig out that internal pith and then start laying, using that stem that is now empty for nesting. And so things like pycnanthemum, mountain mint, as well as coneflowers and many other plants have these nice stems that if you cut back and leave them to about 8 to 24 inches, can be used by native bees naturally. And so there's just so many ways that we can help support all these different types of pollinators, not only with our providing the planting of habitats, but also how we manage them. And so I just want to thank you all for your time and support, and I look forward to seeing you in person in the coming years so that we can talk about and see these pollinators out in action. Thank you so much.